Before this story begins, if you're new here, hit subscribe and ring that bell, so you never miss a story like this one. In the autumn of 1346, Scotland saw its moment. England was distracted. England was bleeding. England was fighting France across the Channel. France and Scotland had bound themselves together 20 years earlier in the Auld Alliance. When France bled, Scotland was expected to draw blood in return. The message was simple. King Edward III of England was trapped at the Siege of Calais. His best knights were dead at Crecy. Northern England was naked. King David II of Scotland was 22 years old. He had been king since he was 9. And he had never won a battle he could call his own. But he had William Douglas beside him, a knight who had spent his life fighting the English. And Douglas believed the moment had come. 12,000 men answered the king's summons. The largest Scottish army in a generation. They would cross the border before October ended. On October 7, 1346, the Scottish army crossed the Esk into England. 12,000 spears pointed south. David rode at the head of the column. He wanted to be the first king of Scotland to see England burn. The first target was Little Peel, a small fortress that had guarded the border for generations. The Scots took it in 3 days. The garrison was massacred. Every man. David gave the order. England would learn what invasion meant. Carlisle bought its safety. £2,000 in silver, a fortune, passed from English hands to Scottish. The city watched the army march past, walls manned and prayers offered. But David did not come for silver. He came for Durham. He came for York. He came to break England. Hexham Abbey fell next. 3 days of plunder. The relics of St. Wilfrid were carried north as trophies. England's holy places burned. The Scots were not just invading. They were desecrating. Every church burned, every shrine plundered, was a message to England that no place was sacred. On October 16th, the Scottish army arrived outside Durham. The greatest shrine in northern England lay before them. And David intended to take it. But England had already moved. William de la Suche, Archbishop of York, was no ordinary bishop. He had been a soldier before he had been a priest. When the Scots crossed the border, the Archbishop did not pray for deliverance. He summoned the northern levies himself. 7,000 men answered. From Cumberland, Northumberland, Lancashire, Yorkshire. They were not knights of France. They were northern Englishmen who knew exactly what a Scottish victory would cost their families. Lord Ralph Neville commanded the English army. He was not an archbishop. He was a soldier. And he had been waiting for the Scots since the day they crossed the Esk. On the night of October 16th, the English army marched north. By dawn, they would be within sight of the Scottish camp. The Scottish army woke on October 17th expecting to sack Durham. They did not know that an English army lay 6 miles to the south. But the English were not hiding. They were drawn up in battle formation. Waiting. The scouts saw them at sunrise. The Scots had been caught unprepared. They had assumed the north was empty. They had been wrong. David had assumed the English would be slow. He had assumed the north was undefended. He had assumed wrong. By mid-morning, both armies were drawn up for battle. The Scots on the ridge. The English on the lower ground. The sky indifferent above them. The Scots advanced down the ridge. They had the higher ground. They had the numbers. They had the momentum. Each man knew what this moment cost. Each man knew what waited at the bottom of the hill. The English archers released. And the sky turned black. English longbows had won at Crecy 2 months earlier. They had not stopped killing since. The Scots reached the English line, and the battle became a butcher's work. When armies this large meet, no man fights alone. They fight pressed against the men beside them, with no room to swing, no room to run. And then Neville saw what David could not. The Scottish left flank was exposed. Neville struck, and the Scottish line broke. The Scottish army collapsed. 12,000 men became 12,000 individuals running for their lives. In battle, panic moves faster than any horseman, and it is just as deadly. But King David did not run. He gathered his household knights around him, and he fought. He was a king, and kings did not run. But kings could die. Then an English arrow found the king's horse. The grey destrier fell, and David fell with it. The circlet fell from his brow, and Scotland's king became England's prisoner. An English knight named John Coupland pulled the king from the mud. The Archbishop of York rode up to accept the surrender. An archbishop had captured a king. No one would ever write that story the way they expected. When the counting was done, more than 1,000 Scots lay dead. Thousands more were captured. The rest had scattered into the northern wilderness. Every one of the dead had a name. Every one had a family. History forgets that. The battlefield does not. David II of Scotland was marched south in chains. He would not see Scotland again for 11 years. The king wore chains, but he still wore Scotland's ring. David was taken to the Tower of London. He would be moved from castle to castle for 11 years. But he would never be free. In the silence of the Tower, David made a calculation. Scotland would have to ransom him, and England would set the price. England demanded £100,000 for David's release. Scotland did not have £100,000. That was not a ransom. That was a crippling. England knew exactly what it was doing. 11 years passed. David learned to wait. He learned to negotiate. He learned that some wars are won in dungeons, not on battlefields. He never took off Scotland's ring. The kingdom might not pay his ransom quickly, but he was still its king. The ransom was finally negotiated down. £100,000 became £40,000. Scotland would pay in instalments over decades. On October 3, 1357, David II of Scotland walked out of English captivity. He had been 22 when he marched south. He was 33 when he returned. David returned to Scotland without a single English arrow following him. He returned without fanfare, without triumph, without the army he had led south. He had gone south expecting to conquer England. He came home having lost everything except his life and his crown. David told them the truth. He had lost the battle. He had lost the army. But Scotland still stood. The lords listened. They had expected a hero. They found a man. And somehow, that was enough. The Battle of Neville's Cross is remembered now mostly by historians. A plaque marks the field. A suburb covers the ground where thousands died. But the battle shaped everything that came after. A king captured. A kingdom ransomed. A lesson learned. Scotland never invaded England again. Not like this. Not with a king at the head of a great army. The lesson of Neville's Cross was carved into the nation's memory. England was never as weak as it looked. David II ruled Scotland for another 14 years after his return. He never led an army into England again. He never needed to. The battle was lost. The king was captured. The ransom was paid. But Scotland endured. And that, perhaps, was the only victory that mattered. Like and subscribe to Empires Untold for more stories that reshaped the world.